Hello, hello. Happy day after Thanksgiving, everyone. Happy Black Friday for those that worked in the retail sector like I did for years. Ooh, I don't like that light. Got to change that. Let that screaming into my image there. So, yeah, it's been a long time, guys. Not for lack of wanting to do these live sessions. I always have so much fun with them. It's just great to, answer a bunch of questions. It's just that timing has just not been in the cards for me. It's been kind of crazy. So regardless, I'm excited to be back. Certainly people already in the chat room, a couple of people already asking questions. Appreciate that. Just little housekeeping, if you can, since I'm the only one here, no one's moderating this. If you do have questions, please, if you can't put them in all caps, it just makes it easier for me to see them. I already got the one about acute dovetails, so you don't have to restate that one. But anything going forward, it just makes it so much easier for me to see it that way. So what I wanted to do was start off talking a little bit about card scrapers. I got a question from Bob yesterday about card scrapers, and I happen to have just recently addressed this in the hand tool school, so there's some stuff fresh in my mind on addressing it. So we'll talk about using them, and I can briefly touch on sharpening them and ways to sharpen them if you're using them and you're not getting the results you want. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about drawbore, mortise, and tenons, and then really going to be addressing what is coming in through the chat room. So yay, hooray. So yeah, as far as everything else that's happening, I do have to throw this in. It is Black Friday, so I do need to mention that there is a sale running in the hand tool school. I'm not going to make a big deal about it, but 30% off. I do this every single year. Runs Black Friday through Christmas in case anybody wants to plant some ideas in the spouse's significant other's heads, or if anybody gets cash for Christmas, the sale runs a little bit past Christmas. So I call it a holiday sale, not a Black Friday sale, but it is there. It's running as of this morning. There's banners and stuff up on the site with the code listed and everything you need. So yeah, if for some reason you don't remember that little Chisel 30 code, it is up there if you need it in the future. So let's move beyond that and let's talk card scrapers. And by the way, I'm pushing out stereo right now. I've got both channels running. I don't know why your sound may only be showing up in one channel. It's the mystery of YouTube. Same reason that YouTube says that they are receiving only okay signal quality right now when my speed test shows that I'm pulling uploading at 180 megabits per second. So Lord knows. So anyway, card scrapers come in all shapes and sizes, and they seem to give people all kinds of trouble. And what I have is, this is kind of the card scraper that I use all the time. I just have this little business card magnet dealie on the back of it, which is used as a heat sink, because as you are scraping, the steel will heat up really fast and you'll burn your fingers. So the magnet is just a nice little heat sink. This scraper, I can feel I've got a burr on the bottom edge. I've actually got a burr on all 4 edges. I roll one, actually I should say on all 8 edges, because 4 on each side. The burr is almost T-shaped, comes up, flattens out, and the burr runs off on both sides. As you're scraping, the important part, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for fine, wispy shavings like this, and generally as they come off the board, they're going to be all tightly curled up like this because of the angle that you're scraping. One of the reasons scraping is such an effective tool for removing tear out is because of the angle of presentation. If you think about the average hand plane that's presenting the blade at 45 degrees, assuming you have a standard frog, it's at 45 degrees. The scraper is much, much higher than that. It's a little hard to see, but I guess this would be 45 degrees. This burr is rolled to engage right about there, which is, I don't know, I'd say maybe 60 degrees. So it's quite a bit higher. And this is a key point, is the engagement, the way the scraper works depends upon how you roll that burr. And if you roll the burr at too acute an angle, first of all, you have to lean the scraper over really far to get that burr to engage. And now I'm actually dragging my fingers on the board, and you're not going to get, it's a lot harder to use. Really, the scraper should be engaging much, much higher angle, or what's the point? What's the point of scraping at an angle that's at or even lower than what I can achieve with a standard bench plane? For tear-out prone woods, I mean, this is just genuine mahogany. This is super easy stuff. We can up the ante a little bit here with some quilted maple. Oops. Let's spin this around a little. Boy, this board is really warped and out of flat. Makes it a little bit more difficult. I need something. I need a shim. There we go. I'll just shim my planing stop up a little bit. Because this board is rocking and rolling all over the place, I would probably want to flatten this a little bit more. So in order for this to do its job, I don't know if you can catch that. Camera can pick up that quilting there, but this board is all kinds of interesting stuff going on. And of course it's maple, so it's already going to be a little bit harder to scrape than a softer genuine mahogany. But it does me no good on a figured wood to have to bend the scraper over too much to make it do its job. That board is way too out of flat to be messing with right now. So first and foremost, you can just scrape straight across the board. You will find that it's easier and you've got more precision control if you are bending it. And what that changes it, instead of scraping along this entire edge, I'm scraping at a central point right in the middle. And you can see, based upon the width of that shaving, the width of this shaving, as I bend the scraper, that's the only part of the scraper that's engaging. And how I like to use the scraper is really as a spot tool. I'll have some tear out in a specific section, and I will just attack that one particular section to remove the tear out. And then I'll come in and I'll take longer strokes to kind of blend the fibers in around that scrape section so that it disappears. In the end, the card scraper is not really meant to scrape the entire surface. You want to do most of your work with the bench plane. Get everything as clean as you possibly can, as finished ready as you can. And if you've got a really difficult wood and the tight mouth and the sharp blade of the smoothing plane, or maybe going to a higher angle frog, is not getting the tear out, then you can come to the nuclear option, if you will, the scraper, the card scraper, and just tackle that one area of tear out, and then use it to blend that in, because obviously it's going to look different from the plane surface. This is not really meant to come in and do the entire tabletop or whatever the top is. That is why we have things like scraper planes. The scraper plane, I personally don't have one. I find that they're kind of overkill for what we normally need. If you have like an entire dining table or a conference table and a really heavily figured wood, then a scraper plane makes a lot more sense. But they can actually be kind of a pain in the butt to deal with, because you've got essentially the frog is adjustable and it changes that presentation angle. It's the same angle we were talking about rolling the burr. So if you've rolled a burr on your scraper plane blade, you need to make sure that the frog angle is set to match and to properly engage that burr, or the scraper plane won't work either. A lot of people actually won't roll a burr on a scraper plane at all. They'll just leave it at 90 degrees, which brings me to my next point. A number 80 cabinet scraper like this guy, I actually don't roll a burr on this. This blade has a bevel on it. It has a 45 degree bevel. I advance the little screw in the back, which again imparts that same bend to the scraper that we had before. And this guy can certainly handle a little bit bigger surface. And one thing with a card scraper you may not realize is you can hollow out a board very quickly. And if I were to hold a straight edge up to this, I can actually see a little divot in there already. So you have to be careful if you're doing a bunch of scraping or remove tear out with just a card scraper. There is no depth stop and you can hollow things out quickly, which is where something like a cabinet scraper comes in really beneficial. Because the sole actually acts as my depth stop and allows me to use it like more of a flattening tool. So this is a good tool for coming back and doing that blending stroke after the fact. Once you've scraped away the tear out, it's really beneficial. But this guy, I don't want to engage a burr on it because in this particular instance, this angle that's imparted on the front here, I would need to roll my burr to exactly match that angle, give or take a couple of degrees, but the optimal cutting function will be that the burr is rolled right at whatever this angle is. I don't happen to know what this angle is off the top of my head. I don't really need to know this because I don't ever roll a burr on it. This edge, the blade down here, is just filed at 90 degrees and no burr has been rolled. And it works just fine. The same thing can work with a card scraper. This is another card scraper that has just been filed along the edge at 90 degrees and no burr has been rolled. And I can get little shavings and I actually can work this very close to 90 degrees. And I get those fun little shavings. The reason for that is this scraper itself, not to mention it's a little bit thicker steel than this one, this will last quite a bit longer. Once I start to roll the burr over, that little bit of steel is actually kind of flimsy and it will weaken and it will tear away over time. The more acutely you roll that burr, in other words, the more you have to lean the scraper over, the more fragile that burr, that little bit of steel becomes. And you'll find that it dulls very quickly. And you actually, and sometimes you'll be scraping along and, sound is a big function as well. You can hear the sound of a properly sharpened scraper. And then suddenly, it's not cutting anymore. And if you look down, you actually sometimes can see the little bit of steel that just rubbed off. It just wore off the edge and it's gone now. Now there's no burr. And generally when the burr breaks off, you need to come back and refile the edge entirely because you've got a bit of a ragged edge there where it was left. So the lower the angle of the burr, the more durable, the more steel there is behind it to back it up. And this scraper is a good example of one that can be used at a much, much higher angle. And because it is so much higher, again, I don't have my fingers dragging on here and it's not nearly as difficult to use either. So that would be the first thing. Anybody who's having trouble getting a scraper working, you probably need to, so how shall I say this? Increase, decrease, make the angle of the burr closer to 90 degrees. Make it like, 85 degrees. So as you start cutting, you can, this is just sliding along, and as I lean it forward, you'll feel when that burr engages, it actually sticks. Just a little bit of pressure, tilting it forward, and then it sticks right at that engagement angle. This is, whatever this angle is my engagement angle, and that's the angle that the burr has been rolled at. This one, it's catching right there. So you can see that's quite a bit steeper than the one before. And I find that a lot of people, when they're rolling the burr, just put way too much on there. So I was just talking about this in the hand tool school the other day. This is the burnisher that I use. I actually got this from Sterling Tool Works, but really just a carbide rod stuck into a handle is all you need. But you'll notice that it's incredibly short. So when I grab the handle, I'm right kind of choked up on it, and I can therefore put a much lighter angle on this. If you've got a long burnisher, say you're using even using a screwdriver, when I'm out here further, the tiniest little change of my wrist will make a big difference in the angle that's imparted to that. So if you're just using a screwdriver, I recommend you choke up on it. I actually set it so that my thumb is right on top of the blade, and I will take my index finger and run it along the face of the card scraper. Now I have to be careful here. If you run it along the face of the card scraper up top, you're gonna slice your finger open on that burr. So I run my finger down lower, put my thumb on top of that, and this actually allows me to establish 90 degrees pretty easily. And I can just tweak my wrist down and change that angle by a couple of degrees or so. I'll also bring it in close to my body as I'm doing this. You can see it's so much easier with a shorter handle deal. You know what, I'm just gonna go ahead and sharpen this. This is gonna be one of those do as I say, not as I do things, folks. I would not normally sharpen a scraper right here at my workbench just because of the metal filings and crap that come off of it. That's what I do at my sharpening bench, but I frankly just don't feel like moving the camera right now. So let's see if we can capture some of the metal swarf here. Now there's all kinds of blocks and stuff you can use. Again, I just like to kind of sight down it, channel my inner square. One thing that can be really beneficial if you use a Sharpie on this edge, so you can see when the Sharpie's gone, the edge is filed. Now I've got a nice shiny edge there. Get any metal filings out of there. Just quickly off camera, I'm running that edge that I just filed on my extra fine diamond stone. Just freehanding it, but again, if you've got like a thicker block of wood, you can use that to balance and keep it at 90. So what I just did real quickly off camera, I'm taking that edge that I filed and I'm honing it. And I think this is kind of a key step. You see, a lot of people will say go straight from the file to roll the burr, but the file is going to give you a sharp edge, but is it going to be all that durable? Because you have a coarser scratch pattern. This stone will give you a much finer scratch pattern, and I could work my way up through my stones. You know, I've got 3 grits of diamond here. I just go straight to my finest grit, and I spend maybe just a little bit more time on it. Again, if you have a thicker block of wood, you can set it against it to hold it at 90 degrees. For me, I just find kind of standing over it and letting the edge guide me. This works just fine. Got a nice shiny edge there. Again, sharpening on your woodworking bench is not really a good idea because of the metal swarf and crap that comes off, and it can get into the wood grain and cause all kinds of nasty problems. So now I have a 90-degree edge here. And you can feel the corners. They're a little bit sticky because it's a perfect 90-degree eris. The intersection of those 2 planes makes a nice sharp edge. Again, putting my thumb on top of the burnisher and kind of anchoring this hand is right up against my gut here, and I will, a couple passes that way, come up to 90, back off from 90 a little bit. I can feel that burr. So now, standing up, it's engaging right there. And that There's proof in the pudding right there. In fact, I could tell that this edge was a little bit dull because I was getting shavings, but I was also getting little piles of dust around it. Now I'm just getting pure shaving. There's no dust at all. From here, the maintenance of this, assuming that I don't work until the burr actually falls off, I can just come back periodically and roll that burr again. I don't need to go back to the file or the stones. Sometimes I can skip the file and just go straight to the stone just to kind of refresh on the edge. But I find that I can continue to roll a burr for 4 or 5 more times before I need to go actually back to a file and a stone. That may vary dependent upon what you're trying to scrape. I mean, for this demonstration, I'm just scraping genuine mahogany, which is super easy to work with. But if I were doing, Pomeli Bubinga or something like that, I'll probably have to resharpen more often, just like I would with a smoothing plane and in any really, really hard jungle wood. So that's kind of the 411 on scrapers. I really am not a fan of the scraper plane because I just find that it's more trouble than it's worth. And it's probably because I don't spend a lot of time working with really, really nasty, interlocked, hard figured jungle woods. I'm more of a, friendly domestic guy, as I'm using genuine mahogany, which is not a domestic. But you know what I mean. I'm not really a figured wood kind of guy. I like just straight grain more than anything else. So, Bob, I hope that points you in the right direction with scrapers. It's something that confuses a lot of people. You're going to find 1,001 ways to sharpen a scraper. They're all legitimate. One thing I should say, this particular burnisher has a conical tip to it. So, if I can get it to focus on me here, this burnisher, you see, comes to that conical point. And this is something that several of the woodworking Illuminati have endorsed, because you can roll that burr and not really worry about the angle. But if I reference the face, the slope of this cone, I can come right up with a point underneath that burr, pull that back, and what's happening is I'm actually setting the burr now. Come on, camera. I'm setting the burr at this complementary angle. And it's repeatable every single time as long as the face of that cone is pressed up against the face of the card scraper. I'm going to get a repeatable angle. So if you do have a scraper plane, you can figure out this angle, set the frog to that angle, roll the burr, whatever you have to do, pull this back in order to set that burr. You're essentially bending it up and forming it into this set angle. It's kind of a nice feature. Again, because I don't have a scraper plane, I ended up not using it all that much. But just an added little wrinkle to card scrapers there. Let me check in with the chat room real quick before we get too far down the line. Good question. Doesn't the bending make waves? Bending of the card scraper, yes, you are creating a concave surface, but it's so light that it's not really that big of a deal. And it's one of those things where, I mean, technically, my smoothing plane has a camber, has a curve on it as well. So just using the smoothing plane, I'm creating undulating waves. But the idea of using a scraper is, again, to remove that tear out, and then those blending strokes around it will essentially lower everything down to the same level. You may find that if you've come back and you start applying finish, or you're maybe wiping this down with mineral spirits kind of before finishing, and you start to see some undulations, you might find that you're scraping too much, or that is where something like this guy can come in handy, the number 80 cabinet scraper, to help kind of control some of that. The sole now flattens things out a little bit more. But really, any planing we do is creating undulations. It comes back to stacking those plane strokes side by side. So as I take a pass here, I've lowered the edge down. I'll take a pass right next to it, kind of overlapping by half the plane. And what I'm doing is creating a uniform surface now. So despite the fact that this smoothing plane blade has a slight curve to it as well, I'm still getting a really flat surface. That and the fact that the curvature on that smoothing plane is so slight that even if I just made a pass right down the middle, it's really not going to be noticeable. And the same thing's going on here. I've pushed them all into the trash now, but you saw those shavings. They were super, super, super fine. Finer actually than what I'm getting off of this smoothing plane, which is about maybe a thousandth and a half inch thick. This is probably half a thou, if not smaller, thickness. So yeah, there's undulations, but they're so slight, and it is up to us to kind of manage those by taking those blending strokes. Ulrich wants to know if you can use a bow saw with sloyd hooks. Find the distance difficult to hold the workpiece and, sorry, my windows are overlapping. Get a full stroke of the saw. I actually don't have any sloyd hooks here in the shop now. I left mine up in Maine. So you're using a bow saw as a joinery saw, as a back saw. I don't think I can demonstrate that either because all I have in the shop right now is a turning saw. My bow saw broke and I've got to fix it. But I mean, the spacing, holding the workpiece down, if you've got two of them and you're holding it firm enough, so what you're having trouble with, let me just grab a turning saw here for demonstration purposes. Okay, so if what you're having trouble with is taking a full stroke of the saw, I'm not sure that I follow that. Let's use this because I want to cut this off anyway. So you're going to have trouble taking a full stroke of the saw, and if you're trying to press it right up against the fence, you may have to extend the whole thing out a little bit more. Probably want to get closer on this, don't we? I mean, if you're sawing right up against the fence, obviously the handle's going to get in the way as you pull back, but you're not sacrificing that much. So what you'll end up having to do is saw away from the hook a little bit more. But what you'll also run into is you need to extend it out over the bench a little bit because the handle's going to want to bump into the hook. Making a crosscut with a turning saw here. It's not the most efficient cut to make. But, I mean, with a bow saw in general, you're going to find that you're never really going to be able to use the entire length of the blade just because of the form factor of the saw. It's always going to be stuck kind of in the middle 2/3 of the blade. So I think in some respects you may be seeing some limitations with the bow saw, but I also may not be following your question exactly. To me, it seems using a sloyd hook, it's not going to be that different from a bench hook like this. you may have two fences and you may kind of trap it in between, but as long as you position the blade and the passage of your hand and the saw through the obstructions, you ought to be able to get a pretty full length of the saw. What you may find, however, is that you might need to beef things up a little bit taller so that the blade runs a little bit higher above the bench. Otherwise, you're going to end up like bumping your hand. Or a lot of people will use a bow saw instead of actually grabbing the handle back here. They may actually end up grabbing the frame itself. And you'll see guys like Frank Klaus who are sawing, holding the frame, and they're actually holding at an angle, and they've rotated the blade to allow for that. And they're sawing up here, which gets your hand out of the way, and it still allows you to take a pretty full stroke because everything, is up much, much higher. This can take a little bit of getting used to because your center of gravity is up so much higher and the thrust pattern wants to drive the saw down. So you just have to kind of play around with that and practice a little bit. But it's one of those things. It's one of the eccentricities of using frame saws in general. It's always going to make things a little bit more difficult. Sorry if that's not the perfect answer there, because I'm a little not certain why you're not getting a full stroke there. Scott says you have the Veritas card scraper sharpener. I had that thing for a while. I didn't like what we're talking about is the Veritas card scraper sharpener that is, it has a carbide rod inside, and you can set the angle. There's a little dial on the knob on the side. You can set the angle and it changes the position of that carbide rod. So then you take the scraper and you just slide it through a slot. And he's right, it's like swiping a credit card. It works fine. I've never really felt that the edge didn't last very long. If you're finding the edge isn't lasting very long, you may just, the angle may be too extreme, or you may not be prepping your edge well enough. In other words, honing it. If you're just coming from the file, you're going to have kind of a ragged edge at a not quite microscopic level, but a pretty small level. You're going to have more of a frayed edge off the file, which as you roll that burr, instead of it being this consistent cutting edge, is going to be more like frayed fingers that come over, and each one of these fingers is going to be much less durable than a consistent edge. Exact same principle of sharpening anything from a chisel to a plane blade. The finer stuff is taking these frayed fingers and unifying them together and making into a stronger steel. Economical solution is go to a steel supplier. For me, my go-to is McMaster Carr, because their shipping is ridiculous. I can order something and it's here the same day. You can buy a small, like 1/4-inch round carbide rod, or it doesn't even have to be carbide. It could be high-speed steel or a harder tool steel. Carbide, I just find works really, really well. This section of rod is only like 2 inches long. Now you're going to have trouble finding it from a supply house, probably less than 6 inches or 12 inches long, but you can buy that for much, much less than $100. Piece of scrap, drill a hole in it, drive it in, you've got a handle. Or you don't even have to have the handle. If you want to go truly ghetto, just grab the rod and go from there. There's no reason to have any specialty tool. I like the fit and the form factor of this handle, but that's something that could easily be turned or sculpted yourself. Ferrule, if you want to put a ferrule on, a piece of copper pipe, works great. Let's see. Casto says, I have a number 4, number 5, router plane, and block plane. What would you recommend as the next plane? Oh boy, those are tough questions to answer because it depends on what you want to make and what you want to build. With the 4 or 5 and a router and heck, and a block plane, you pretty much could do anything you could dream of. Are you a full hand tool guy? Are you more of a hybrid guy? You can use the jack plane for your rough dimensioning. You can use your jack plane for trying or flattening. So you pretty much are from rough board all the way to finish ready. You're probably okay there. So it would most likely, next plane would be a joinery plane of some sort. So, you know, if you see yourself building a lot of drawers, then yes, a plow plane's a really good idea because you're going to need grooves for your drawer bottoms. Frankly, my favorite tool is just a rabbet plane. Wooden rabbet plane. This is a skew model. This is a 1-inch thick model. I got this at an antique store years ago. This is probably the most used joinery plane in my shop, so much so that I have a 1-inch, I've got a 1.5 inch, I have a 1/2 inch, and 2 3/4 inch models of that rabbet plane because they just get used all the time. They're so incredibly effective at not just cutting rabbets, but cross grain, truing up, tenon cheeks if necessary. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to be in a situation where grooves are going to be important, a plow plane is a pretty good idea. You know, Veritas has complicated the issue by bringing out that combo plane, which is super expensive, but you really don't need all those blades. I've had a chance to play around with it. I've got several students who have them. To me, if I were going back, you know, when they were all available at the same time, I mean, I've had this Veritas plow plane since it came out. Use it a lot, but if I were, you know, didn't have it and was buying something new today, I would probably buy the combo plane because it just adds a little bit more mass and a little bit more option that I don't have with that regular plow plane. Vintage wooden plows are a nice option as well. They can be a little bit more finicky to play with. When you've got the screw fence like this is kind of nice. I actually prefer the wedge set fence like this guy. It's just a little bit easier to pop the wedges out, adjust the fence as needed, and tighten them back in. You can give them a little hammer whack to tighten it up instead of fiddling with all of the washer and nut on these things. But you know, they're an acquired taste. So I don't know. I think I end up recommending plow planes to people more than anything else. You said your block plane is standard block plane is always a good idea to have around, but one thing you might really look at is a rabbeting block plane. This happens to be a Lee Nielsen model, but there's several companies out there who make this. Veritas makes one that has a fence. I really would never use the fence for this, but this is really beneficial for truing up joinery, tenon cheeks and things. It's not a bad idea to have one of those around. What I would say is look at whatever your next project is going to be and figure out, you know, which plane would benefit me the most. If you were building a chest of drawers and had to make 8 drawers, that's a lot of grooves. If you're doing frame and panel stuff, that's a lot of groove work. And a plow plane could be really beneficial. If you're just going to build maybe a table and there's no groove work in it, but a whole lot of mortise and tenon joinery, or you're thinking something that helped me true up my mortise and tenons, a rabbeting block plane would be the answer. So the answer is, depends upon what your next project is. All right, I got 20 minutes here. I go beyond 20 minutes and then the wood whisperer is going to sick his army of people on me and say, get into my room. What can a person do with a plow plane? You can make grooves. Lots and lots of grooves. That's an interesting question. Bench Doxy wants to make a rocking chair and is looking for suggestions on bent lamb without using power tools. Yes. Well, you're going to have to resaw a lot of material in order to get your thin laminations. So certainly you want to have some capability. If it's just a rocker, they're going to be narrow strips. So you don't really need like a dedicated resaw frame saw like I've got. Just a regular old 5 points per inch rip saw would be plenty sufficient to rip those strips. What I would recommend is getting, you know, a thicker block, probably just to get a good grain match. You want to get your laminations all out of one block, but embrace the technique that like pit sawyers would use. Instead of sawing each board its full length, what they do is, say you've got a cant, or in this case, your block for your bent lam, you would saw to about 2 inches from the end of the board, and then come back and make another kerf, and another kerf, and another kerf, leaving that 2 inches or so connected at the bottom. So at the end, you've got a bunch of individual strips that are all connected to the bottom, kind of like, a deck of cards almost up here. That gives you a little bit of structure as you're sawing through things. And then as you just come in, you can either just split them off right at the end. It just gives you a little bit more oomph to back up the saw cut. The thinner and thinner you go with those laminations, you get to the point where it's really difficult to hold the work and continue to saw through. So keeping it all in one piece will really, really help. Then what you need to do is be prepared to flatten those boards. So you're going to need to have a way to plane really thin strips. And a lot of bent laminations, you're talking 3/16 or a 1/16 of an inch thick. Generally, at least somewhere in the middle, 1/8 of an inch is where you may see a lot of them, depending upon the extremeness, the steepness, the tightness of that curve. You're going to want thinner laminations. For a typical runner on a rocker, it's not that dramatic of a bend, so 1/8 inch thick laminations would probably be okay, but you still need to be able to plane them down, and you want to plane them to consistent thickness. If you have laminations that are thinner in one section or the other, they're not going to want to bend evenly. So and even if you've got a nice like two-sided form that's coming together and sandwiching together, you get these little undulations. If you have a section that's thinner, it's going to want to hinge in that thinner section, and it will cause some glue adhesion problems. You may have trouble getting the laminations to close up all together. So probably what you want to end up doing is create like a thicknessing jig of sorts. And you see these from time to time where they are kind of like a U-shaped trough that you can stick the lamination into. So if this were my piece that I wanted to laminate, you would set it so that the walls here, the sides of the trough, and obviously my dimensions are all off here, but I would set it so the plane could ride on top of it. So as you set this, obviously we've got a bit of the blade that's not exposed on either side of this. You want the rails to run on this. And a lot of people, what they'll do is in these little side wings, they'll actually cut a rabbet in so that the plane not only sits on top, but it sits and rests in those rabbets. So it prevents it from moving side to side, and it just rides on a track. And again, the rabbets are riding on either side of the blade, so the plane is not cutting into the trough itself. And it's set at a set height above the work. So you can come in and plane your way down, and when it's sitting in the bottom of that trough, it will give you an exact thickness all the way along the board, and it just makes it really repeatable. You could certainly do this with just, marking gauges, just like we do with any board in any project, plane down to the line. But if you had like 10 or 12 of these to make up your lamination, it's just so much easier to have this kind of planing thickness jig that the plane just kind of rides on. And what happens is you can actually put shims underneath it to lift the board up, and that's actually what I recommend. Instead of making like a single-use planing trough, although if you did a lot of bent laminations, it might be a good idea, but you can put shims underneath the board. So if this is my shim and here's my planing piece, well, I've now raised the piece up, and I can decrease the thickness just by raising and lowering or adding more shims underneath it. That will give you a consistent thickness. You would want to do that on both sides of the board, so you've got a good glue surface on both sides. So you take that into account as you're thicknessing. So probably what would make the most sense is to have the trough set up, to cut. You've got a shim in here, and that shim is maybe a 1/16 of an inch thick. And you plane down until your plane stops cutting. In other words, the track stops it from cutting anymore. Then you take the board out, remove the shim, flip it in for end, and now you plane again. Now you're planing the other side, and you just drop the board down whatever the thickness of the shim is. So you've got a nice clean reference surface you just planed here. So you're going to get a board that is going to be parallel to each other, clean glue surfaces, and at a set thickness from end to end. And it's really kind of idiot proof at that point because the plane just stops cutting when it bottoms out. And anywhere it cuts, you just keep working it through until you get a nice consistent thickness. And that way you can basically doing the work of what the drum sander would do here to get a clean glue surface that is a consistent thickness. And then from there, the glue up would be the same, power tools or not. Good question, very good question. All right, I'm going to move on to mortise and tenons. Oh, Dane. Hey, Dane, how are you, buddy? Carbide high speed or carbide drill bit. That's a really good, for a burnisher, an affordable burnisher. Very good idea. I've actually got a drill index of high speed steel, really small bits that I use. Each one of those would work really well because, again, they're short enough. So what I want to do is create a mortise and tenon here. And somebody asked a question about avoiding breakage on small mortise and tenons. When making tiny tenons for a scale model, how do you prevent tear out and breaking? Tear out? I'm not worried about tear out on a tenon, just breaking of the tenon. When you've got really small tenons, specifically what we're really talking about is thin tenons, you need to pay very close attention to the grain of the wood. If you don't have consistent grain, so if the grain skews at all as it moves into the tenon, that really thin piece is going to be weak. You want to make sure the grain runs straight through that tenon, or position the tenon in such a way that you're going to have through grain. Otherwise, it will be very weak. The biggest error that I see people committing when cutting tenons is there's always a slight overcut. As you're sawing down the cheek or you're sawing the shoulder, you'll see people who cut like a hair past. And what you end up with is a tenon that is almost perforated at the base. It has a weakness built into it because it doesn't, the inside corner of the shoulder and the tenon is not a clean junction. It comes down the cheek and then it curves back into a kerf and curves back around. And it's almost like you've perforated the edge of the tenon and will make it snap. Or you've actually decreased the final thickness of the tenon because you overcut that. That all by itself will make for a very weak tenon. So really, the only tip is to practice good tenon technique by not oversawing, observing the grain, making sure that the grain is going to follow the entire length of that tenon. Certainly, there may be some merit to saying choose the appropriate species. Sorry, my heater just kicked on there, guys. It was getting cold in here. But I don't want to overstate anything and say, there's one magic bullet species out there. If you use, this particular species of wood, all your tenons are going to be good. But one thing I can tell you that I've come up with over the years is I find that if I cut my tenons starting with the shoulder cut, cannot see that line in the dark. So instead of sawing the cheek first, I will now saw the shoulder first. And I will specifically not saw all the way to my line. Well, maybe a little bit closer than that. Let me saw the other cheek real quick, or the other shoulder real quick. So this tenon shoulder is, you can see the kerf is just a hair away from my line here. I've left some space right there. A little bit of space where the kerf doesn't go all the way to this line. And what that allows me to do is now saw down the kerf, and I've got that little buffer section there. If you saw right to the line, there's always a chance that you've reduced the thickness of that tenon. Now I rely upon the kerf to come down and sever this. And if for some reason it doesn't pop away cleanly, there's such a tiny little bit left that I usually just snap it off. Now, as I saw down the cheek, if I were to go past my line here, it's not nearly as big of a problem. Certainly, it might leave a little gap, which I don't want to see, but now the kerf is running along the grain, along the fibers, so you're not compromising the strength of those fibers at all, like you would be if you actually cut across it and you're severing those fibers. But in this particular instance, my kerf came down and it basically just intersected the saw kerf that I made on the shoulder, and I've completely left every bit of the tenon intact. Here again, that vertical kerf perfectly intersects the shoulder cut. And now when I come down here, it should just come away cleanly. But if it doesn't, you may have some little clinging fibers, usually just a little pop like that, and it comes off. Sure enough, I just had a little section right here that was clinging onto it, which is super easy to clean up, just using a chisel. Just marking my shoulders because I didn't do that before. And for fun, let's run the line down the face. Now I didn't saw the shoulders here, so I'm going to stay away from the shoulder line. In this case, I stayed a little too far away, but that's not too bad. So, the question that I had earlier was drawboring. And are there kind of rules of thumb for when to drawbore and when not to drawbore? And this is actually really glad to hear this question, because I think that drawboring has become super popular to the point where I'm hearing from a lot of people they're drawboring like every damn joint. This cut was not quite square, so I'm just going to true it up real quick. So every single mortise and tenon people are cutting has a drawbore peg in it, and it's like, you know what, sure, that will make for a stronger joint, but really where the drawbore is most effective is when you have dynamic forces, dynamic stress on there, like a chair, where every time you sit down or stand up or lean back on the chair, you're putting dynamic stress on those joints. And what the drawbore does is it puts the joint under tension. It puts it under compression as it pulls it up tight like that, and it allows it to resist those dynamic forces. A static load, like you would see in a normal cabinet, is really not having that problem, unless you like live in an earthquake-prone area or something like that. So for the most part, if you see like the mortise and tenon in a door, a lot of times that's just pegged, and it's not actually drawbored. It's just a peg, as it goes through the joint. There's no offset, I should say. It's just perfectly lined up. And what that's doing is just adding a little bit of mechanical interlocking. It's not pulling the joint into tension. And that's a particularly key point to make. So that's what you need to ask yourself. Do I drawbore this? Do I not drawbore this? It comes down to what kind of forces are going to be hitting that particular joint. 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be okay without the drawbore. But if you want to get fancy and you really want to add that, you can throw in the drawbore. But you have to recognize that now you're adding in that tension and that compression, and things can go wrong. And especially because now we're drilling a hole near the end of the board. So we've got some short grain backing it up. And if you make that offset too much, or you try too big of a peg through or something like that, it will pop the end grain right out of the end of this tenon. So the rule of thumb that I will always go for is I like to bore the hole for my offset no closer than 1 inch from the end of the tenon. So if my tenon's only 1 inch long, I don't want to drawbore it. And if I'm in a situation where I really need a drawbore, I've got a 1 inch long tenon and I have dynamic stresses, I need to figure out another solution there. Figure out a way that I can elongate that tenon by maybe making it a through tenon and wedging it, which is what you see in shorter situations like this where I just don't have an inch here. Now I've also got other interlocking dry and green wood type stuff going on here, but a lot of times you'll see wedges holding through tenons in place, which adds a mechanical joint. It doesn't necessarily put it under compression, but it will put it under compression as the joint is stressed. So if I can't drill my hole 1 inch from the end, I want to seriously rethink it. Or I need to change the size of the hole I'm drilling, make the peg smaller in order to kind of give me a little bit more room to play with. You could put that hole almost right on top of the shoulder, because that's the strongest point of the tenon, is right down here at the base. And I've got all this wood backing it up at the shoulder. At the same time, you need to look at where that hole would intersect the mortise. If by putting the peg like right next to the shoulder, well, that's going to put the peg on the mortise wall right up here at the top with very little grain backing it up. So it's a balancing act. You have to play, into the shoulder close enough, but far away from the shoulder that you're not weakening this. So I try to stay at least a 1/2 inch down on the mortise, so a 1/2 inch into the face, which would put me a 1/2 inch away. Now this is the center point of the circle. A 1/2 inch away from the shoulder, but yet 1 inch from the end of the tenon. That's kind of the rule of thumb that I follow. You can fudge that one way or another. But if you fall inside that, you need to think twice. If you fall dramatically inside that, I would avoid doing a drawbore altogether. It's just one of those things where you try to drive that offset through, and without enough material around it, there's a lot of force happening as that peg is driven through. Now, the only other factor in this is the peg itself. And, you know, certainly you can use commercial dowels for this, and they won't always break on you. Some of the uglier commercial dowels have actually run out in the grain, and they will snap when you try to navigate the offset. But the thing you need to look at is, what species am I using? Hard maple is not a very good peg species because it does not compress very much. It doesn't bend really easily because it doesn't have any room to compress. So as you try to bend a hard maple peg around a corner, it's going to create a heck of a lot more stress on that end grain, and it will probably cause it to snap not only the tenon, but probably even snap the fibers on whatever your mortise board is as well. So if you need to have a white wood or a lighter wood for that peg, you probably want to use something like ash. You know, ash is a ring porous wood. It's got big pores. It's going to bend a lot better, much better than any diffuse porous wood, especially a diffuse porous wood like maple. I use cherry from time to time for drawbore pegs. Cherry is a diffuse porous wood. The pores aren't quite as small as maple. It's not as hard as maple, but I try not to use anything more than a 3/8 inch peg in drawboring in general, but with cherry, I like to try to go smaller. I'm usually going with a 1/4 inch peg because the thinner peg's got a little bit more bend to it than the thicker 3/8 inch. This doesn't mean that I don't use 3/8 inch, but if I'm using, I'm trying to see if I have one in here. If I'm using a 3/8 inch cherry peg, I have really made sure that I've met those criteria. I'm in an inch, probably more than an inch. And if you think about it, a 3/8 inch peg is kind of big. If I were mortising, or if I were drawboring this little tenon with this big 3/8 inch peg, proportionally it just looks silly. So I'm going to want to use a much smaller peg for that anyway. Well, the good news is if I have a bigger tenon to proportionally go with a bigger peg, I've got a lot more room to play with along the length of the tenon and on the thickness of the board that I'm pegging into through the mortise. So play with the size of the peg, but also play with the species. To me, red oak and white oak is like the optimal drawbore peg material. Got great bending strength to it, great strength in general, you know, because of the ring porous nature, it also rives really easily, which means you can drive it through a dowel plate and make much better pegs. So follow that rule of thumb, and then vary your peg stock, your peg thickness, in order to ensure that you end up with something a little bit less of a roll of the dice. Now there are, drawbore pegs that are available on the market. This happens to be a Ray Isles drawbore peg. I think Lee Nielsen makes drawbore pegs. You can make your own drawbore pegs using some drift alignment pens. Christopher Schwartz has an article on that somewhere on the internet. The drawbore peg can pull the joint together, and because it's a tapered peg, you can drive it in and essentially kind of twist it around and deform the material. So you're already pre-deforming things to allow for a little bit easier passage of the peg to go through. There's not quite so much stress as you're driving that peg through. The other thing I want to mention with the drawbore peg is you absolutely must positively, do nothing else, point the peg before you drive it in. You can see this conical point on here has been pointed. That's actually a little too steep for my taste. This is what I end up doing more often than not. In fact, I just run over to my pencil sharpener and I sharpen it down to a point. Now that means you have to have a peg that's long enough to compensate for that. I've got to drive it through enough that the full diameter fills it up. But this tight point will very easily navigate that offset. If you have any hard shoulder at all on here, even this peg, on the other end of this peg, I've got, here, let me go to a better. So I come down to a solid point here. Dark brown against dark brown. So you see the solid point there. On this end, I've got a flat on the end. Now that may be okay, but if that flat gets caught on the offset at all, it's going to jam in place and it's going to cause all kinds of problems. This tight point will very easily navigate around that offset and make things go together more smoothly. The Drawbore peg can help by starting that deformation, so to allow that passage to go a little bit easier. Honestly, I rarely use those Drawbore pegs because severe pointing like this, severe pointing, it sounds like a punishment. You're going to get a severe pointing, young man. That could go really wrong fast. So anyway, that's my thought on Drawbores. I think 9 times out of 10, it's people trying to put it too close to the end of the tenon. Because they're worried, like I said, if they're worried about putting it too close to the edge here, you've got a lot more strength with the fibers running this way and putting the hole close to the edge than you do putting the hole close to the edge when you've got short end grain running out. This is going to break out in a second. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I'm over time here, so would you say the same rules apply to simply pinned as Drawbore? Probably, Dane, just because even though you're not adding the compression into things, this is the weakest point right here. If you've got a hole that's right up near the end, say if I'm inside an inch, all I've got is this little bit of short grain. Add to the fact that all I have is just the thickness. This is a 1/4 inch tenon. There's not much strength there at all. So while there may be an interlocking joint, now granted, we have all this glue surface at the same time. When the glue cures, it pretty much, is one entity. It's not 2 entities joined together anymore. It's all one entity. So there's a lot of strength there, but I just think it's a good idea. Or in the case of a lot of smaller pieces, like I built a shaker wall clock a while ago, and the mortise and tenon pieces for the little top door, the tenons were like 3/16 thick and like 3/4 of an inch long. You can still use pegs there, but now you use really small pegs. Use 1/8 inch pegs or even smaller pegs. And they're just adding that little bit of interlock, but you're still trying to stack it closer to the shoulder in that instance, just so you don't have that short grain. But, did I need to peg those joints in that wall clock? No, not at all. You want to talk about a low use item. The most tension that wall clock goes under is when I pull out the key to wind the mechanism, and that's, yeah. So you do have to think about, do I really need a peg or not? But even without the offset, it's not a bad idea to follow that rule of thumb. Cool. Well, I may have missed a few questions here, but I don't want to run too much into Mark's Friday Live here. Even though he says he doesn't care, I don't want him to get mad at me. I don't want the Wood Whisperer Empire coming down on me here. So that's it, guys. If I missed your question, I'll take a look at the chat room and I'll try to address it after the fact, but hopefully I can get myself back into a groove here and we'll do this again next month, if not before then. So thanks everybody for coming out, and don't forget, in case I haven't said it enough already, yay! Hand tool school sale, 30% off any product. Go over there and spend some Black Friday money. I'm absolutely terrible at self-promotion. Makes me nervous to say stuff like that. All right, guys. Everyone have a wonderful day, and we'll see you around.